Is the vaccine safe? Is the COVID vaccine safe? You've probably seen in the news where they've come up with a couple of these vaccines and they're incredibly effective. Over 90, 94% at preventing COVID. That's a miracle of modern science. This pandemic is going to rage on and kill Americans and keep us all at home, not working indefinitely. Enter the vaccine. That's what's going to end this thing. But the vaccine process, which normally takes 10 years to develop a vaccine, we've done it in 8 months. Is that safe? Did we cut some corners? And further, what about this mRNA vaccine, which while there have been some trials, it hasn't been widespreadly used on a human population. Is that safe? I'm ER Dr. Larry Burchett, MD. I'm on the front lines of this thing. This is a very real question for me. One of the hospitals I worked at is offering the vaccine before Christmas. I'm gonna have to make that decision. I did my research. I want informed consent, and I want to have that conversation with you about risk, benefits, and alternatives of the vaccine. I'm going to give you my take so you can make up your own mind, okay? So this comes, again, in this context where in May 2020, over 70% of Americans said they would get the vaccine. But it was a political year, and people worried that Trump was trying to push through a vaccine before it was ready to help his chances of re-election, and those numbers dropped to 50% ineffective. 50% of people said they wouldn't take the vaccine, worried we had gone too fast. So big pharma, scientists dug in. We didn't release the vaccine too early. We waited for the data, went through the right process. I'm going to explain some of that. Big pharma even came out with the following pledge, which I was a little skeptical of, but actually I like it. They said they would pledge to always make the safety and well-being of vaccinated individuals their top priority, adhere to scientific ethical standards, only submit after demonstrating safety and efficacy, and work to ensure a sufficient supply and range of vaccine options, including those suitable for global access. I like that. The vaccine's got to work, it's got to be safe, and let's think about the whole world, not just ourselves. But still, it was pretty fast, 10 years down to 8 months. Do you know what the fastest vaccine ever made was? How many years did it take? What was it? 4 years. It took 4 years to develop the mumps vaccine in 1947. Now that's 70 years ago. We ought to have more technology and efficiencies to get it done faster in 4 years, right? Listen to this. This was very interesting. This is in a Yale article that they interviewed Dr. Saad Omer, global medicine, Yale Institute of Global Medicine, and he's on the World Health Organization group for these vaccines. And he said, look, we didn't cut any corners. Instead, there were efficiencies in making this vaccine. Let me give you some examples. Remember how we make a vaccine? You do some research, then you start studying it on animals. That's phase 1. Hundreds of humans is phase 2, and then thousands of human beings would be phase 3. And he said, look, we didn't skip any of those steps. We did them at the same time. So instead of doing phase 1, doing a review, waiting, signing people up, doing phase 2, they layered them and did them at the same time. They started to review results earlier in the process instead of waiting. They got manufacturing ready in anticipation that things were going to come. They still had to demonstrate that it was effective and safe. So let's talk about the details of one of these, the Pfizer vaccine, and what they actually did. Pfizer did a study of their vaccine on 44,000 volunteers. Remember, this is phase 3 clinical trial where they do it on tens of thousands of human beings. And the purpose is to make sure it's safe. So they're going to study 2 things, okay? Adverse outcomes. That's a serious condition that results it's either permanent or it requires medical treatment afterwards. So if somebody had a severe anaphylactic reaction, allergic reaction to it, that would be an adverse outcome. Or if they developed some kind of spinal cord problem like transverse myelitis or a neurologic problem like Guillain-Barré syndrome, all those things I just mentioned are known. About 1 in a million, 2 in a million complications of vaccination. There is some small risk, 1 in a million, 2 in a million, risk of vaccination, okay? That's a risk. Now, in medicine, we always talk about risk, benefits, and alternatives. The benefit of vaccination always has to outweigh that risk. 1 in a million thing of problems versus the protection, the immunity you get, and the protection from the disease, right? We don't want, if it's a disease nobody's going to get, we're not going to immunize people for it, right? But if it's cervical cancer from HPV, which a significant amount of women die from, a vaccination can prevent cancer and prevent death. And so in this case with COVID, we're going to talk about the risks of the vaccine. We're going to get into that in a second. And there's some unknown in there. But it's the benefits of not dying of COVID, not getting COVID, and having these post-COVID syndrome, long hauler, fatigue, shortness of breath, headaches, stuff that people get. Who knows if people are at increased risk to have heart attacks and strokes and kidney failure, even if they survive COVID. So if you're worried about this unknown, if you're worried about the unknown, God, I'd be more worried about the unknown of COVID, getting COVID. And the benefit of not dying and getting COVID, it's going to outweigh. But so let's get into this. So 44,000 volunteers volunteered for this Pfizer vaccine phase 3 study. Half of them got the vaccine, 22,000, and half of them got placebo. So they're comparing it to getting nothing. Of those 44,000 people, they had 170 that got COVID. 162 of them, of those 170, were in the placebo group. 8 of them, only 8 were in the vaccine group. 162 versus 8. So what is that? 20 times got it? Those that didn't get the vaccine. There were 10 people that were very sick, got severe COVID. 9 of those were in the non-vaccine group, and only 1 of them was in the vaccine group. So they conclude, hey, this is 94% effective, and they report no adverse outcome. So the severe stuff that you look at, and this was the FDA said, look, for us to approve something, it's got to be 50% effective. This is way over that, and safe in a 2-month monitoring period. So in those 2 months, they didn't see any evidence of adverse outcomes. Now, there were side effects, okay? People were sore. About 3.7% of people reported fatigue, 2% headache. It's not too bad, right? That's anticipated. When you get shots, that is a normal sign for some people that your immune system has identified and is reacting, is probably making antibodies. That's a normal thing to expect with vaccination. Now, I want to say something about this is the key part of the whole thing, okay? And I want to be very honest about this with you. So the 2-month period is very short. Most of the time, these adverse events, these significant stuff, is going to happen early. But 2 months isn't like you've monitored it for 20 years like a pertussis vaccine, for example, where we have more data and we can be more safe. There's a slight bit of risk of the unknown, okay? Now, and there's a few things I have to say about that. Number one is we are going to continue to monitor for adverse reactions in vaccines. That's what phase 4 of the clinical trial is. So phase 3, you demonstrate that it's safe on 20,000 people. It is. You move forward and you do it on a larger scale. Now, what's going to happen is if you have a 1 in a million complication, it's probably not going to show up in 22,000 people that get it, right? But if you give this thing to 330 million Americans, you're going to have 1 in a million whatevers that show up. That's going to be part of the process. And so we need to make sure we got the structure in place to evaluate for that. That is phase 4 of the clinical trial. And I'm going to tell you some of the review agencies that are not part of the drug companies that are in place to follow that. One of them is called VAERA, Vaccine Associated Reportable Events. Okay, this is a government-run organization that monitors for these vaccine events. Now, another aspect to this, when they're going through these trials, you go back to stage 3, there are independent review boards that are not part of the drug company that are watching the trial go on, and if it's not safe, They shut it down or push pause. Great example of that was AstraZeneca in the summer. One of theirs, there was a concern somebody had a spinal cord condition, transverse myelitis. So they pushed pause on the trial because if that's true, they don't want to give that to anybody else. They evaluated it and concluded, no, this wasn't from the actual vaccine, and the trial continued. Those kind of regulations are in place as we move forward through this process. So a couple of those agencies, DSMB, Data and Safety Monitoring Board, you can look these up. VRB-PAC, Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. Well, that's a whole bunch of... Those are the things that are in place during these trials to continue to keep a very close eye on. Look, 2 months isn't going to tell us 100% of what we need to know. But in this case, when we've got 3,000 people dying per day of COVID, cases going up, 200,000 per day, this is sufficient for us to move forward with the next step. It's not 100%. There is some risk, but the benefit to the individual and society is far outweighed given what we're facing with COVID, okay? So I want to be honest about things and not blow it off and say, oh, 2 months, it's 100% perfect. No, we're going to see some 1 in a million things that are going to come out in the next 6 months, year, whatever. But it's not going to be 100% of everybody is going to die of a heart attack in a week. Like, that's insane. You're more likely to die of COVID, right? Even if it's, 0.01% if you're 25. So 1 in 10,000 who get COVID at age 25 are going to die. Are going to die of COVID. Nobody's died of the vaccine. Even for young people, there's that benefit. But then also, if you want to let's get into this long hauler stuff again. I saw a couple of really good studies. Number one, even for young people that they did in this study, 25% of them, I think this was like 18 to 35, 25% of these young people still had COVID symptoms at 3 weeks, starting to get into these long haulers. They did another study. There's another study on people at day 40, and 91% of them reported they were not back to normal at day 40. We're getting all of this data. These are persistent symptoms. I'm worried that people that get COVID, what are they going to have in the future? Brain and heart and kidney and lung and all of this, that's unknown. Get the vaccine so you don't have to deal with all of that. Risks and benefits. That said, we have the appropriate stuff in place to move forward and to follow this and to do what is best for people. So that's the discussion about, is this thing safe? Now let's talk a little bit about mRNA for a second. So normally when we give vaccines, sometimes we give sometimes we give live viruses that can't reproduce. Like there's a nose flu virus, it's live, reproduces in your nose, but it can't elsewhere because they genetically modified it. Sometimes we inject proteins or part of the capsule of the virus so that our body will make antibodies to it. In the case we get the real virus, our antibodies fight it off. In this case, we're talking about mRNA, genetic material of the virus, not the whole thing, a small portion, okay? So number one, it ain't the virus. It's not gonna get you sick. It's just a small portion of viral DNA, RNA, messenger RNA to be specific, that when it gets into your cells then make the little viral piece, and then that is encountered with your immune system, and it creates the antibody, and it creates your defense. It's like seeing what the enemy's got, making your defense, building up your antibodies. Now, people are concerned, wow, we haven't done this on a large scale. There's some unknown as to what may come of this. Is this manipulating genetic material? But really, it's something that's just going to be degraded and consumed by your body. And that happens in a period much quicker. Again, this 2-month period is most likely sufficient to uh, it's most likely sufficient to account for whatever's going to happen with the viral mRNA injecting that into our systems. Again, you've got those concerns. We're going to have ongoing monitoring, but it appears for the first 2 months that things are fine. And again, we're weighing this against this disease, this COVID. Yeah, maybe it's 1 in 10,000 if you're 25, but it's more like 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 if you're over 80. Do you want the side effects of COVID, which may be long-term stuff, long-term symptoms versus, the 2 to 3% side effects with no adverse outcomes demonstrated yet in this vaccine. So for me, and then the other advantages are you get the vaccine, you get protection, you can feel better. I'm not telling you start hanging out at nursing homes, but you can feel better about seeing your parents and grandparents and not being a vector of transmission for this thing. And the big picture of the whole thing, really, this miracle of science, is for all of the misery that is COVID, for all the unemployment, for the mental health stuff, for all the stuff going at home, for people that can't travel and do what they want, not to forget those who have died and those who have put themselves at risk, all that stuff. These vaccines will end that. They will get us back to normal in the world. That benefit. So let's review the whole thing. What's the risk? There's certainly a risk of this getting sore. You have some fatigue, headache, mild symptoms. People reported that. There is that, but there doesn't appear to be any adverse events right now. And we're going to study that on term. There's a small amount of unknown in there, for sure. And I would assume, like all vaccines, that there'll be a 1 in a million of significant adverse outcomes. Okay, that's the risk. The benefit is 95% protection against COVID and all against getting super sick from that. And then hopefully from the long-term, not only symptoms, but then other risks, which we don't even know what all of those are. What's the alternative? Collectively, the alternative, so we've got risk, benefits, and alternative. The alternative is don't do the vaccine, don't do it, don't get it. What would happen? Then we're looking at herd immunity, probably longer lockdowns and quarantines, millions of dead Americans, more people would die. Now, on an individual basis, the alternative of not getting the vaccine, again, is those risks of getting COVID and dying, of getting COVID and getting long-term problems or symptoms, the risks that you can be transmitting this to loved ones. That's the risk. That's the alternative of not getting this vaccine. Not to mention, who knows what all the problems will be with immunity passports and can you fly if you've had a vaccine and all that stuff. So it should be clear, I'm going to get the vaccine personally. I'm going to check and see if I've got antibodies to COVID, first of all. I'm going to get the vaccine for my own well-being. I know there's a little bit of risk in there, but to me, it makes more sense than getting COVID and all those problems. But then also, it puts me at ease about seeing my dad and grandmother and not worrying about giving this to my daughter and the people I love. That one really makes a lot. And my patients, that one makes a lot more sense to me, that's a relief of my anxiety. There you go. That's my informed consent. I'm going to get it. I'll put a video up when I do it. You can interact with all of these points on avirpoint.com. Please send me a message, Dr. Larry Burchett, anywhere. If you disagree with this, you have questions or whatever, but that's where we're at today with what we know about COVID vaccine safety. Hope you've enjoyed this conversation and making sure I hit everything over here. I'm sure I missed something, but continue to do your part. We're going to get through this. Stay safe, stay sane, take care of yourself. See you next time.